Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, I want you to take a deep breath, because you're really going to need it. Today, we're not just looking at some dusty old history. No, we are taking a literal descent into madness. We're going to explore the crumbling, absolutely oppressive walls of Eastern State Penitentiary. You know, when the city outside is completely alive at midnight, stepping into this place feels like time has just entirely stopped. So let's step into the dark together and see exactly what's waiting for us.
There's this saying about Eastern State. Some places don't just hold memories, they hold something that remembers you. Just let those words hang in the air for a second, right? It perfectly captures the absolute, profound dread we're going to unpack today. I mean, think about it. What if all that trapped energy, decades of isolation, pure fear, and just total agony, what if it literally never left?
To really grasp the horror here, we gotta understand how this place was built. Eastern State opened back in 1829, and it wasn't just your standard prison. It was a hardcore psychological experiment designed to completely destroy and then rebuild the human mind through total, suffocating isolation. Inmates lived in these tiny stone cells, and their only source of light was the single skylight they called the Eye of God. The guards literally wore soft shoes so you couldn't even hear them coming, and if a prisoner had to be moved, they were forced to wear thick black hoods, plunging them into absolute darkness. It was an environment specifically engineered to break the human psyche.
Which brings us right back to a really chilling question. What actually happens when decades of trapped agony are just left to stew? See, when the prison was finally abandoned, something incredibly strange started happening. The pure madness that had been cultivated inside those walls for over a century actually began to manifest. So let's move away from the history books and begin our physical descent into the prison's haunted depths, starting with the very first terrifying anomaly.
Our explainer takes us first to cell block 12. Now, this is the site of one of the most famous early incidents. We've got a maintenance worker who goes in to do a totally routine job, just fixing a broken lock on an abandoned cell. But as he tried to yank out the old key, he claims something grabbed him, and it wasn't a physical hand, it was this massive, invisible, overwhelming force that just violently pulled him backward.
So imagine being completely paralyzed. You can't even scream, and you're just watching the impossible happen. He said the shadows on the stone walls literally started moving on their own. They were twisting, stretching out, almost like they were breathing. And then, one of these shapes formed into something that looked unnervingly human, but entirely wrong. It was way too tall, way too thin, and it had this completely empty, hollow face. When the worker finally snapped out of his paralysis and bolted out of the cell, this massive scream echoed down the hall right behind him. And it wasn't his scream, it was deep, ancient, and honestly sounded like the building itself was remembering the pain.
All right, let's fast forward a bit. Picture this. You are stepping into the pitch-black corridor of cell block 6 alongside two modern paranormal investigators, Mark and Daniel. It's exactly 2:43 a.m. The prison is completely empty. No tours, no staff, nothing. As they're standing in this super long hallway, just surrounded by dark open doorways, this highly methodical sound suddenly breaks the silence. Tap, tap, tap. It's not echoing footsteps, guys. It's the sound of something lightly hitting the inside of the solid stone walls, moving from cell to cell and getting closer to where they're standing.
They freeze right outside cell 6. The massive, heavy iron door, which they absolutely hadn't touched, is slightly cracked open. Daniel pushes it, and it gives off this unnaturally loud creak. In a matter of seconds, Mark's thermometer absolutely plummets from a totally normal 18 degrees Celsius down to a freezing 9 degrees. The air gets so incredibly cold that Daniel's breath actually turns into this thick, visible cloud right in the beam of their flashlights. And then, something moves in the corner.
Deep in the back corner of that cell, a shape slowly starts forming, almost like thick fog literally pulling itself into a solid body. It's way too tall for the ceiling, its head is tilted at this completely impossible angle. There are no eyes, but both men feel this incredibly heavy, intense focus locking straight onto them. Daniel grabs his temple, practically in agony, his breathing goes completely ragged, and he stammers out maybe the most terrifying realization of the entire night. He says the entity isn't making a sound, it's invading his mind. It is literally thinking at him.
Bang! The heavy metal door of cell 6 violently slams shut, locking them right inside. Mark is frantically pulling on it, but it absolutely will not budge. The temperature drops even lower into this dead, freezing cold, and that towering shadow in the corner,
It doesn't float. It takes these slow, deliberate, incredibly heavy steps forward. The air pressure in the room completely shifts, making it feel like they're being pushed underwater. And then, right next to Mark's ear, this ice-cold voice whispers, "You shouldn't be here." Somehow, by some miracle, they barely managed to escape when the door just clicked and unlocked itself. But guys, our descent is far from over. We are actually moving deeper now, way off the tourist paths and into this sealed, totally avoided corridor to ask a really horrifying question. What was hidden in the silent cell? Because this is a cell with absolutely no number, no official record anywhere, and an atmosphere so incredibly thick it feels like it actively rejects anyone who even tries to come near it.
When investigators finally forced this forgotten cell open, they found the walls completely covered in these deep, overlapping, frantic scratches, and they spelled out one single phrase: "It is not silent." You see, records from the 1800s actually mention a prisoner who was kept right here in extreme confinement, and he started having full-blown conversations with the dark. A guard even noted that the prisoner would speak, and then a lower, slower, completely unnatural second voice would answer him back. Tragically, the prisoner was eventually found dead in the corner, his fingers practically bleeding from carving that exact phrase into the unyielding stone.
Decades later, a modern paranormal team is sitting in the absolute pitch black of this exact same cell. After capturing some really faint whispers on their audio gear, they made the mistake of asking a fatal question: "Can you show yourself?" Instantly, the temperature violently dropped again. One of the investigators just froze entirely. He stopped breathing normally, just staring blankly at those scratched up walls before whispering in absolute terror that something was standing directly behind him.
The audio they captured from that moment is just bone-chilling. The microphone clearly picked up this cold voice right near the equipment saying, "I never left." Obviously, the team fled in a total panic. But when they analyzed the recording later, they found something infinitely worse. Hidden right beneath that first voice was a second, much quieter voice speaking at the exact same time. But here's the catch. It wasn't answering the investigators. It was talking to something else entirely. Two voices, same exact moment, only one visible source. Yeah, no thank you.
Okay, so if you think the cells are terrifying, we really have to ask, what on earth lies beneath the prison? We are now plunging into the absolute darkest, most claustrophobic depths of Eastern State Penitentiary, a hidden, entirely unofficial underground passage that the old workers used to call the body chute. It's a place allegedly used to move things super quietly, things that, quite frankly, were never meant to come back up. So, a brave crew of 3 investigators manages to get access to this dark, incredibly narrow tunnel. As they carefully descend these tight stone stairs, their footsteps naturally echo. But the echoes are weirdly delayed, almost like something down below is mocking them, repeating their sounds exactly 1 second later. And the moment they reach the bottom, their thermometer is just locked at a freezing 3 degrees Celsius, which, to put that into perspective, is a completely impossible reading for an underground tunnel that has absolutely zero airflow.
They look down, and the floor of the tunnel is completely coated in this thick, undisturbed dust. Except for one thing: fresh footprints. They were definitely human-shaped, but the spacing between them was way too wide, and the depth was completely uneven, like whatever made them just didn't walk normally at all. As they push deeper, the air gets incredibly thick. In a tunnel barely wide enough for one person, investigator Chris suddenly freezes, steps back against the wall, and whispers that something had just walked right past him.
Suddenly, their flashlights flicker and just completely die. In the pitch black, this low, incredibly heavy, dragging sound starts moving straight toward them. They ran. I mean, wouldn't you? Their dropped audio recorder ended up capturing their frantic escape perfectly. First, you hear their running footsteps, then you hear that heavy dragging in close pursuit, and finally, a really slow, deep, non-human breath. And just before the recording completely cuts out, a voice whispers directly into the mic, "You came down."
After that, the tunnel was strictly shut down, off limits. But 3 days later, Mark, remember Mark, the investigator from cell block 6? He felt this undeniable compulsion to return. He actually went down there completely alone at 1:12 a.m. By 1:15, a heavy dragging sound began perfectly matching his own footsteps. But the absolute most terrifying detail? When he finally reached the bottom, those wide footprints in the dust no longer just led forward. They now led in both directions. Something had come back up. The unnatural freezing cold from the previous investigation? It was completely gone now. It was replaced by this suffocating, heavy, dead stillness. Mark walked deeper into the abyss,
until he found fresh, literal bleeding marks carved right into the solid stone wall, reading, "You came back." Dust was still falling from the freshly broken stone, guys. And then, a voice echoed. But it didn't come from down the tunnel. It sounded like it was coming from inside the solid stone walls themselves, just whispering, "You heard me."
Mark slowly turns his camera, and for the first time, he captures it fully. It's this towering shape, its limbs bent at completely impossible angles just to fit inside the narrow space. And its face wasn't empty this time. It was violently shifting, almost as if multiple expressions were all fighting to form at the exact same time. It speaks again, delivering a horrifying message: "You didn't leave." And in that freezing moment, it hits Mark. It wasn't talking about the trapped energy in the prison, it was talking directly to him.
The camera drops, boom, hits the floor, but it keeps recording a terrifying final sequence. First, you hear the chaotic sound of Mark's running footsteps, accompanied by that really heavy, unnatural dragging noise. Then, there's a violent sound of something hitting solid stone. After that, completely dead silence. Finally, just before the tape reaches the end, this incredibly faint, extremely close whisper hisses right into the microphone. "Come back up."
The camera was recovered buried in the dust days later. Mark, however, was not. The official report on this is chillingly, terrifyingly brief. Missing person, no signs of struggle, no evidence of exit. He simply vanished completely into the dark beneath the penitentiary, leaving absolutely nothing behind but an unanswered question.
Now, you'd think the nightmare ends underground, right? Well, not quite. Days later, staff did a totally routine inspection of the upper levels and made a pretty grim discovery. Up in cell block 6, that heavy iron door was slightly cracked open again, literally spilling freezing air out into the corridor. And on the floor of the cell, fresh footprints. But they didn't lead into the cell. They only led out. Whatever was waiting down in that tunnel beneath the prison had officially arrived on the surface.
Which kind of leaves us with one final, super unsettling thought here. Visitors still walk the halls of Eastern State Penitentiary today. They take their pictures, they laugh, they enjoy the history of it all. But listen, if you ever find yourself standing quietly in the dark halls of cell block 6 and you feel a sudden freezing chill, you really gotta ask yourself, is that just a draft from an old broken building? Or is it a breath right behind you?